this session, Complexifying Difference, Black and Third World Feminisms. Third World, in inverted commas, for the reasons I explained on Tuesday, because it's very much a concept from its period. And what it means is women from developing countries and women who are minorities within first world developed countries. Do I need to do anything about this SW update? No. So this is a picture from the American Black women's movement, both in Europe and America. Black women found it necessary, very early on, to start organising among themselves in order to begin to think through and put racism on the agenda. Yeah? Because if you only see feminism in terms of gender oppression, then you don't get the specificities of what happens to people who aren't part of the hegemonic group in a particular society. But of course, racism was and is a huge issue in the United States. It's a big issue in Europe too, but in a different sort of way. Yeah? Because of the history of the United States, and because until relatively recently, really, 2 or 3 generations back, it was slave owning in the South. This means that the whole area of race relations has developed very differently than from in Europe. Because although Europe was involved in the slave trade and had plantations, they were somewhere else. Okay, so it was very different. These are Black Panther women, Black Power women from the early 1970s. Black Power movement was actually extremely sexist, but its attitude towards women was really quite bad. That was also true of the left in general, both in Britain, Europe, America, all these countries, particularly in America. And I can remember when I was a postgraduate student in the 70s, I can remember in a seminar a Chilean refugee saying that feminism was a bourgeois deviation from the real struggle. Yeah, obviously he was a communist Chilean, but so the idea that that class was the most important struggle was on the left was very widespread. The idea that you actually have to look at class and gender together was very much a minority position. Or class, gender, and race together. Come on. Seems to be stuck. We go down to the next one. What is it about today? Right, now you can try. No, can we try full screen again? Just see if it works.
Oh,
no. Sorry. Some days don't get off to the best start. Not just taxi drivers. No, let's hope it works. Okay, racism and the problem of whiteness. First of all, some definitions. First one is from Audre Lorde, who, as I said to you yesterday, was one of the most radical Black feminist writers. Racism, the belief in the inherent superiority of one race over all others, and thereby the right to dominance. Sexism, the belief in the inherent superiority of one sex over the other, and thereby the right to dominance. It's a belief. It's a really important word there, because for belief you don't have to have what? You don't have to have evidence. Belief is a question of belief. It's not a question of science or evidence or whatever. So it's a real problem with attitudes that are founded on belief, in the sense that they're not always open to rational argument. Okay? And that's certainly the case when it comes to white supremacy. The reason racism is a feminist issue is easily explained. This is Barbara Smith, another American black feminist writer. The reason racism is a feminist issue is easily explained by the inherent definition of feminism. Feminism is the political theory and practice to free all women, women of colour, working class women, poor women, physically challenged women, lesbians, old women, as well as economically privileged heterosexual women. Anything less than this is not feminism, but merely female self-aggrandizement. And then Audre Lorde again. By and large, within the women's movement today, white women focused upon their oppression as women and ignored differences of race, sexual preference, class, and age. Now, if you think about what I told you on the first day about how the women's movement really got going, for lots of women, through consciousness-raising groups, and the primacy given to experience, so you talk about your experience, it's not really that surprising if you're in an all-white, middle-class, all-white group of women, and you talk about your experience, that you talk about one sort of experience, which is framed as much by class and by your, your position in the broader sort of racial hierarchy in that society, that, that you wouldn't actually think about women from other backgrounds. And, people tended, consciousness-raising groups and also sort of political organisations, often they form by who you know and who you talk to. So they often just tend to develop, people talk with people who are like themselves a lot of the time, rather than people who are very different. So it's not so particularly surprising. There is a pretense to homogeneity of experience. That's the problem for Audre Lorde. You pretend that we all share this experience. Yeah? We have this global oppression of women. You pretend that all women share the same sort of experience, covered by the word sisterhood, powerful word, sort of enabling women together can change the world, can get rid of the patriarchy, all that sort of language, that does not in fact exist. Yeah? So all women, although they may all have experience of all sorts of different things, you might have experience of domestic abuse or rape, or you might have experience of not being promoted in the workplace, or so on and so forth. But that experience is going to be different depending on where you're positioned in the other aspects of social hierarchies. Gender is rarely the only signifier of biologically grounded. Gender is rarely the only significant biologically grounded signifier of social and cultural difference. In racist societies, and most societies are racist to some degree, where whiteness is hegemonic, so we're talking about here Western societies where whiteness is hegemonic, skin colour and phenotype. Phenotype is what you look like, okay? Your hair, the shape of your face, these sorts of things are inescapable markers of difference. However much an individual might want to escape racial categorization and be seen merely as an individual, she or he finds her or himself confined by white society's implicit and explicit definitions of whiteness and racial ugliness. These definitions are not merely the property of prejudiced individuals. This is a really important point. It's not just that you have these prejudiced individuals, they're structural, inhering in the discourses and institutional practices of the societies concerned. So they're taken for granted, really. And why are they taken for granted? Because they have a long history that goes back over hundreds of years of attitudes that change. I'm not saying they don't change, but there are always residues in the culture of of what people think looking a particular way means. Okay. If you think about Orientalist discourse, you think about Orientalist painting, think about the sort of preconceptions of the East that you find in 18th and 19th century European culture. Those ideas, those Orientalist ideas about, particularly about, sexuality and women and so on, they're still, you still find them. You still find them in popular culture. You still find them in all sorts of aspects of contemporary culture. key point about whiteness is that in societies where white's the dominant, whiteness is unmarked. In other words, what's meant by that is that it's the norm. Yeah, everybody else has a colour. But if you're white, you don't. You're just white. You're just normal. Okay. Classical racism, which developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, goes back to the 1600s, but it gets very big in the 18th and 19th century. Consistently placed white people at the top of its scale of racial difference, seeing them as the most advanced of the different races. Now, as some of you will know, with the scientific revolution in Europe, which came in the 17th century, you get this move to classify the world in scientific terms. One of the forms that took was the development of what was called natural history. So you had people going out as explorers and as scientists, trying to classify all the plants, all the animals, all the butterflies that you could find all out throughout the world. So if you go into European museums, you see these huge collections of butterflies from everywhere and all sorts of things that were collected by explorers going out to try and sort of map the world in scientific terms, map the natural world. And this then was extended, excuse me, I've got a bit of a sore throat. Just as well we're watching a film in the second half. So this was extended to human beings, yeah? Because obviously as Western explorers encountered human beings on a larger scale, who didn't look like them, this raised the question of what that difference meant and how it came about. And so they began to categorize human beings into races, which became the basis of what would be a racial science. In the late 20th century Western world, this assumption lives on both the ideologies of the radical right. You only have to go on any radical right website and you'll see the sort of 18th and 19th century views are still alive. I went too far. It's just moved, isn't it? Yeah. And in the normative status usually given to whiteness by mainstream society. Whereas right-wing extremism privileges whiteness as a racial category, this is rarely the case outside of these circles. So, the world has changed. In mainstream discourses of race, whiteness functions as an unmarked neutral category, a norm which is equivalent to being human. Rather than being a racially marked category, whiteness signifies an absence of colour. Discourses of race are silent about the status of whiteness as a socially and historically changing construct, and its role in the perpetuation of racist assumptions. The best example I can think of what I mean by whiteness as a socially and historically changing construct would be, the way in which it shifts in the United States. If you think about all the mass immigration at the end of the 19th century, and how there are lots of books on it. So how particular groups of Southern Europeans or Jewish people gradually get assimilated into the hegemonic white majority. Okay, but when they first arrive, just like Hispanics now in America, they're seen as somehow a different group. Yeah. One consequence of this failure to recognize the racialized nature of whiteness is that race and racism come to be seen as the problem and responsibility of people of colour. And this is one of the main points that motivated a lot of the writings of black feminists. So that, race doesn't affect us if we're white, therefore we don't need to worry about it. If you're subject to racism, well, you must do something to change it. It's not our... But of course, racism only functions because of the binary oppositions that underpin it. So you wouldn't have a notion of black difference if it wasn't defined against the notion of what whiteness was. Okay? So it's a bit like the argument about females and males. So you're not really going to change society by just changing femininity. You need to change masculinity as well. Okay? Because one is defined against the other, and it's also a question of who does what and what resources people have access to. bit like the discussion we were having yesterday about, whether or not we should have conscription for women in order to equalise Korean society. Audre Lorde powerfully voices this issue. Whenever the need for some pretense of communication arises, those who profit from our oppression call upon us to share our knowledge with them. In other words, it is the responsibility of the oppressed to teach the oppressors their mistakes. I am responsible for educating teachers who dismiss my children's culture in school. Black and third world people are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. That's one of Audre Lorde's books. There is no hierarchy of oppressions. So redefining difference, black feminism and feminisms of colour. Gloria Anzaldúa is a Chicana feminist. People who practice racism, everyone who is white in the US, are victims of their own white ideology and are impoverished by it. You can see it's a very radical statement. Lots of white people wouldn't wish to accept a statement like everyone who's white in the US practices racism. But this takes you back to this thing about intentionality, and you as an individual versus your position in the social hierarchy, which privileges you because you are white. Okay? But we who are oppressed by racism internalize its deadly pollen along with the air we breathe. Make no mistake about it, the fruits of this weed are dysfunctional lifestyles which mutilate our physical bodies, stunt our intellects, and make emotional wrecks of us. The recent emphasis on difference in feminist theory and politics, in part, has been a response to black and third world women's critiques of white Western feminism. The emphasis on sisterhood in the 1970s and on the shared global oppression of women belied the failure of a largely white and middle-class movement to recognise racism and colonialism as fundamental forms of oppression in the lives of women of colour. As the above quotation from Gloria Anzaldúa suggests, this oppression not only affects the material, social position of women and men of colour, but also their physical, intellectual and emotional lives. It is a crucial element shaping subjectivity and agency. I was watching a programme last night on Al Jazeera English, and they had a documentary on about the number of people in American prisons who've been arrested for a crime, who can't afford bail because they're poor, they can't afford the bail, and therefore are imprisoned. And the particular state they were looking at was Mississippi, which isn't the most progressive of states, of course. Most of them were black, not all of them, but most of them were black. What happens is they then end up in prison, but they haven't been charged with anything. And some of them are in prison for a whole year before they're charged. But the way in which the law is administered in Mississippi means that although legally they're entitled to a lawyer, they don't get a lawyer until they're indicted, until they're charged. Yeah? So they sit in prison for 11, 12 months, doing nothing, not having been charged with anything, and having no access to a lawyer because they can't afford to pay one. Yeah? And so it was quite an interesting documentary, but the thing about it that I want to draw out here is that obviously has a massive effect on how you feel about yourself. Just, you sit in a prison cell for 12 months, and lots of them are, the cases are dropped because there's no real case there. And then you're released. They had one young man who was in for 5 years before he was actually freed, yeah. And all the charges against him were dropped. But so it's the facts. It's the way in which things like that affect subjectivity and your sense of yourself and your agency. That's what this sort of feminism was interested in. If at the beginning of second wave feminism, white women's history and cultural achievements, just as an aside again, I don't know if you follow the news, I don't know, the hotel I'm in doesn't have CNN, but because I'm married to an American, we seem to have it on all the time at home. And So you're constantly being, CNN International is constantly, apart from showing Donald Trump every day, is mostly showing all these instances that keep being reported now, that used to be reported in international television, of the problems of Black Lives Matter and all the sort of police violence against black people in the United States. And there again, it's that sort of institutional structural thing, whereas if you're black, the police assume that that's the issue here. If at the beginning of second wave feminism, white women's history and cultural achievements were marginalised or hidden from history and required an extensive work of recovery, this was even more the case for women of colour. As Barbara Smith argued in 1997, so we are talking with all this stuff about the 1970s. The reason I'm saying this is because, and I'll talk about this tomorrow, the other day when Professor Reed was at lunch and he said, "Have you got to third wave yet?" Yeah. It's because this notion that third wave always says it's sort of self-definition is it's a reaction against the sort of narratives and theories of second wave feminism, and it looks at difference and it looks at individual specificities. It takes into account class and race as well as gender. And that's something new with the 1990s. Well, this is the way in which histories get rewritten, because actually all these debates, although the ones that hit the headlines and the ones that people know about are the radical feminists, for good reason, nonetheless, in the 70s, all these debates were already underway, which is why I'm not a huge fan of a notion of third wave, because I think it sort of misrepresents the way in which things develop. But we'll come back to that tomorrow. So Barbara Smith writes in 1977, "Black women's existence, experience and culture, and the brutally complex systems of oppression which shape these, are in the real world of white and/or male consciousness beneath consideration, invisible, unknown." Largely excluded from both analyses of how patriarchy functions and from the development of new feminist historical and cultural canons, Black feminists and other feminists of colour set out to recover their lost histories and their cultural productions. And, we talked a little bit about identity politics. Well, one of the reasons why identity politics develops is precisely because of the exclusion and marginalisation that was experienced by women who weren't part of the mainstream group who got feminism going. They also sought to develop modes of analysis that contest the marginalisation or absence of questions of racism in much white feminist theory and analysis, offering alternative approaches to the question of difference. In the United States of America, the source of much black feminist theory and scholarship, so most of it starts there, because that's where the problem is most pronounced. Other groups of minority women have fought for recognition of their ethnic specificity, for example, as Asian Americans or Native Americans, Hispanic Americans or Chicano women. They've usually been included within the more general term women of colour, a term which can also include African American women. And we'll see an example of that in the film when you watch it, because it's a history really of this period. So key issues then. Key issues in black feminism. There have always been black women activists. This is some known like Sojourner, Harriet Tubman, Frances E.W. Harper, Ida B. Wells, Barnett, and Mary Church Terrell, and thousands upon thousands unknown, who had shared awareness of how their sexual identity combined with their racial identity to make their whole life situation and the focus of their political struggles unique. Contemporary black feminism is the outgrowth of countless generations of personal sacrifice, militancy, and work by our mothers and sisters. A black feminist presence has evolved most obviously in connection with the second wave of the American women's movement, beginning in the late 1960s. Black, other third world, and working women have been involved in the feminist movement from its start. Both outside reactionary forces and racism and elitism within the movement itself has served to obscure our participation. In 1973, black feminists, primarily located in New York, felt the necessity of forming a separate black feminist group, and this became the National Black Feminist Organization, the NBFO. Okay? Black feminist politics have also have an obvious connection to movements for black liberation, particularly those of the 60s and 70s. Many of us were active in those movements, the civil rights movement, black nationalism, Black Panthers, and all our lives were greatly affected and changed by their ideology, their goals, and the tactics used to achieve their goals. It was our experience and disillusionment with these liberation movements, that's the crucial bit, the disillusionment of these liberation movements, as well as experience on the periphery of the white male left, that led to the need to develop a politics that was anti-racist, unlike those of white women, and anti-sexist, unlike those of black men and white men. Perhaps the most important principle in black feminism is the refusal to see racism and sexism as discrete and separate forms of oppression. Black feminists insist on seeing the two as interrelated. Racism not only classifies certain groups of women as different on the basis of phenotype and skin colour, but also as inferior. Skin colour and phenotype matter because racist discourse and practices makes them matter. White supremacist practices systematically define people of colour as different in negative ways. Black feminism is a response both to these racist definitions of blackness and to the devaluing of women of colour on the basis of their difference. Black feminism is thus a challenge to the exclusion from a predominantly white women's movement and the refusal of white feminists to acknowledge the centrality of racism and recognise how it creates material differences in black women's lives. Okay, as in the white women's movement, reclaiming history is a very important theme. I think we talked a bit about this the other day, the way in which there were no resources in which to teach women's history or women's literature or women's art because it had never been researched, it had never been collected. The histories of black people and other people of colour, both in the West and in their encounters with the West, are histories of repression and resistance. Tied in with the histories of colonialism, slavery and segregation, they are histories in which racist ideas and practices play a central role, yet they are also histories of resistance to racism in all its forms. Crucial in these other histories are positive narratives of historical agency and self-definition in the face of racist stereotypes and Eurocentric narratives of history. So again, it's a bit like what we were talking about yesterday. You don't want a history that just defines you as a victim. Okay? You want a history that recognises that you had agency, or your forefathers, foremothers had agency and resisted. Whereas histories of oppression throw important light on the present as well as the past, histories of resistance provide alternative traditions in which to ground positive ideas of difference and new forms of subjectivity. Okay? Think about it in the Korean context. I'm sure that, I'm speculating here, but I'm sure that, sort of narratives, individual narratives of resistance and of what, under Japanese occupation are quite important for the idea of Koreanness and agency and so on and so forth. Not just being, subject to Japanese colonialism and forced to learn Japanese and changing names and all the rest of it, all that sort of history, but resistance to that. Okay? Even though it's not you, even though you weren't even born then, it has a function and it makes you feel differently about yourself. Okay? So if you look at young black people in Britain, the slave trade in Britain, it's a long time gone, yeah? And slavery was in the colonies, it wasn't, on the doorstep. Nonetheless, in teaching that history, the idea that, that it wasn't just, Christian white liberals who pushed through abolition of the slave trade. It was actually, a lot of black campaigners, ex-slaves, and so on and so forth, is important because it offers sort of positive role models. Black feminist concern with history extends to literature, music, and the arts. In the feminist cultural politics of the 70s and 80s, the absence of black women from the rewritings of literary and other forms of cultural history, and the construction of alternative artistic literary traditions confirmed black women's suspicion of white racism. White feminist work on women's culture took little account of black women's achievements. Black feminists played little part in redefining the canons. At best, they found themselves offered a token space in white-controlled anthologies. Writing in 1977, Barbara Smith argued that the absence of black feminist perspectives was essentially a political question. The development of black feminism, she suggested, suffered from the lack of a political movement able to, give power or support to those who want to examine black women's experience through studying our history, literature, and culture. There is no political presence that demands a minimal level of consciousness and respect from those who write and talk about our lives. Finally, there is not a developed body of black feminist political theory whose assumptions could be used in the study of black women's art. And the film we're going to watch later on is a good example of an attempt to create a text that gives access to that history in a positive way. Interestingly, it's not made by a black American filmmaker, it's made by an Asian British filmmaker. There you go. I mean, that says something about the nature of this form of activism in that period. Smith stresses the political importance of history, literature and culture, as well as black feminist political theory. The history of oppression is important to understanding the current position of black women. The history of agency, resistance and creativity is no less important. Much work has been done within black feminism to recover the history of black foremothers. These include, that's again, we talk about forefathers. This is a neologist, a new term, black foremothers, like her story. These include women who resisted slavery, political activists, and writers, musicians, and artists. This work recovers a radically different history from that found in most white-dominated institutions and helps articulate positive notions of difference and tradition. Ironically, in the United States, there was the fact that there had been segregated education, so you had black colleges, meant that there were sites where some of this material had been held, and that there had been people interested in it. We were starting from nothing. Re-theorizing difference. For black women and other women of colour, the social markings of difference is part of everyday life. It can take many forms, from the negative stereotyping of everyday racial abuse to a romantic, often primitivist celebration of black and Asian female difference, which reaffirms deep-rooted racist stereotypes. Yet in both cases, racism defines, contains, and controls. One of the key issues for black feminism has been the assertion of the right to redefine the meanings of difference. This has meant contesting long-established assumptions and stereotypes and asserting new meanings. In the face of mainstream white scholarship, which has consistently defined black women as different, often in racist ways, and excluded them, the key focus of black feminism has been to identify and challenge the negative images of black women's difference that have persisted since slavery. Another has been to recover this difference, locating it in an historically separate experience which has produced different positive cultural traditions. Some black feminists, influenced by the broader Afrocentric movement within black thought, have taken ideas of difference further. Afrocentrism can be described in Foucauldian terms as a reverse discourse. So there was, I think probably still is, a dominant narrative of history in the West, which starts. History is seen to start in ancient Ur and Mesopotamia, so in the Middle East, and then you have Egyptian culture, and then you have Greek culture, and then you have Roman Empire, and then in Europe you have the Dark Ages, which we don't talk about, and then you have the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and that leads then into the present. Okay, that's a sort of narrative of history in which, which is a narrative really of the development of the West. Afrocentrism offers a competing, different narrative which looks back to Africa and revalues like the African roots of culture. So these black feminists, I'm just going to read that bit again. Some black feminists influenced by the broader Afrocentric movement within black thought have taken ideas of difference further, locating black women's difference beyond their immediate environment in their African roots. Here, questions of authenticity and belonging are important. Particular constructions of Africanness ground positive articulations of difference and identity. That the Africa in question has little to do with the historical and social reality of the multifarious countries and cultures which make up contemporary Africa is of little importance. So really, it's an imagined Africa, okay, but it has a very important ideological role. So, whereas, to go to that point again, whereas Western narratives of the development of European civilization work by constructing a history which links Egypt, Greece, Rome, Renaissance and post-Renaissance Western Europe, suppressing what does not fit within this narrative, Afrocentric history reverses Eurocentric history, rewriting the meaning of ancient Egypt as the source of black rather than white civilizations. So a sort of debate about were the Egyptians white or were the Egyptians black, sort of. And looking on old pots and seeing black faces and black figures, and privileging those aspects of African history and culture which testify to the complexity of African civilizations. So a move to look back at African civilizations pre-colonialism, when there were some very highly developed kingdoms, culturally developed kingdoms, like Benin is the one that's usually quoted. In its strongest forms, Afrocentrism works with what Foucault calls a reverse discourse. It reverses the meanings and values commonly found in Eurocentric history, refixes the meaning of blackness, and offers apparently authentic forms of black subjectivity. Patricia Hill Collins takes a more differentiated approach to Afrocentrism, advocating a meshing of theory and lived experience, which can acknowledge and respect difference without fixing them outside history or contemporary social relations. I'm going to give you a quote now from Hill Collins. Individual African American women have long displayed various types of consciousness regarding our shared angle of vision. By aggregating and articulating these individual expressions of consciousness, a collective, focused group consciousness becomes possible. Black women's ability to forge these individual, unarticulated yet potentially powerful expressions of everyday consciousness into an articulated, self-defined, collective standpoint is the key to black women's survival. Black women's struggle involves embracing a consciousness that is simultaneously Afrocentric and feminist. Okay, so any questions so far? Well, I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about identity politics. Black feminism in general, and Afrocentric feminism in particular, have at times taken the form of identity politics. Very much a feature of feminism in the United States in the 1980s, identity politics focus on the oppressions of specific groups of women, Black, Hispanic, Native American, lesbian, and many other. One important feature of identity politics is the sense of solidarity and positive identity that they offer to the marginalized group, forming a basis from which to develop strategies for contesting specific forms of oppression. The identities imposed on marginalised groups and minorities by dominant white heterosexist cultures are identities against which new senses of self and group are defined. These new identities are also shaped by resistance to specific forms of group oppression. Perhaps the major problem with identity politics is the tendency to define identity in particular fixed ways, which ultimately work to exclude many of the women that the group in question wants to reach or represent. When we watch the film, you'll see June Jordan talking about the way in which, in the 1970s, you had a group of black women together, and the question was always, in the background, was were you black enough? Did you have a proper black consciousness? Yeah. Could you match up? So if you have this sort of fixed notion, it can be exclusive and it can be difficult for many women. In a strong criticism of identity politics in the black feminist context, Heidi Safia Mirza suggests, she's a black British feminist, suggests that, and here I'm quoting, identity politics, a political ideology that consumed the 1980s, was based on the premise that the more marginal the group, the more complete the knowledge. In a literal appropriation of standpoint theory, the claim to authenticity through oppressive subjecthood produced a simplistic hierarchy of oppression. The outcome was a cliché-ridden discourse which embodied the holy trinity of race, class and gender, within which black women, being the victims of triple oppression, were the keepers of the Holy Grail. I mean, the problem here is that, and this is something that Audre Lorde contested right from the start, is that if you argue that you have to have experienced the oppression to really know what it is, and to be able to talk about it, I mean, you could argue you know it in a different way if you've experienced it than if you've only read about it or something, which is certainly the case. But if you do that, then it's like saying nobody else can really understand this oppression, and then nobody else is responsible for it. Okay, so you hand it over, you sort of relieve other groups of an attempt to actually understand where you're coming from, okay, which is exactly what Audre Lorde wants to contest. She wants, for example, in the American context, she wants white women to take responsibility for racist practices in America, just to acknowledge that they benefit from them, and to do something about them. That's the crucial bit. The solution within this conceptualization of oppression was to change personal behavior rather than wider structures. Now, it's not to say that it's not important to change personal behavior, it is. But if you really do need to change the structures in a time when what should be done was replaced by who we are. So that's that move from what should be done, issue-based politics, to identity politics, who I am politics. Freedom to have was replaced by the freedom to be. Identity politics offered no radical way forward in the critical project of revealing how we come to be located in the racialized and sexualized space where we reside. Although this may well be recognized by many women as an accurate description of some aspects of the nature and implications of identity politics as they developed in the 1980s, they undoubtedly played a more positive role for many women than this count suggests. Also, I mean, it's a misconception, it seems to me, to assume that people only have one identity. And people have multiple identities. And there are times when a sort of politics based on identity can be quite useful. But there are things that it doesn't allow you to do. Coming together on the basis of specific oppressions, for example, as black lesbians, was crucial in contesting the marginality and invisibility of particular groups of women, voicing their presence and needs, and for analysing the power relations structuring the oppressions to which they were subject. Bell Hooks, for example, although critical of the restrictive impulse of identity politics, suggests that, quote, contemporary African-American resistance struggle must be rooted in a process of decolonization It continually opposes reinscribing notions of authentic black identity. This critique should not be made synonymous with a dismissal of the struggle of oppressed and exploited peoples to make ourselves subjects, nor should it deny that in certain circumstances, this experience affords us a privileged critical location from which to speak. This is not a reinscription of modernist master narratives of authority which privilege some voices by denying voice to others. Part of our struggle for radical black subjectivity is the quest to find ways to construct self and identity that are oppositional and liberatory. So again, this leads you to a position where you see identity as multiple, and it's not just one thing. Postmodern blackness. Bell Hooks wrote an essay called Postmodern Blackness. So how do you rethink a black politics that doesn't rely on identity politics, in other words? Identity politics were one answer to the question of differences between women, yet feminists anxious to avoid fixing the meanings of difference in advance increasingly turn to postmodern theories of subjectivity, meaning, and power. These offer ways of theorizing subjectivity and identity as discursively produced, multiple, and changeable. And that's what I'm going to talk about tomorrow, in a large quantitative class. In the introduction to a volume of essays entitled Black British Feminism, Heidi Safin Mirza writes, postmodern theory has allowed the celebration of difference, the recognition of otherness, the presence of multiple and changeable subjectivities. Black women previously negated and rendered invisible by the inherent universalizing tendency of modernity finally have a voice. We appear to have arrived. Here we are afforded the status of Black British feminism. Postmodernity has opened up the possibility of a new feminism of difference. Such a feminism now allows black women the legitimation to do what we have been doing for a long time in our own way. So rather than because it is open to different approaches and it's much more pluralist, it doesn't say that there is one true way of doing things. It allows for competing in different ways of addressing questions. More or less what she's saying. We have now been afforded an intellectual space to valorize our agency, to redefine our place on the margins. Bell Hooks acknowledges the potentially liberatory power of postmodern notions of blackness, which do not limit it to essentialist versions of subjectivity and identity. So just as there was a tendency to essentialize women on the basis of social and cultural notions of what their body has meant, the same was true for black women, and this is what this allows you to escape. Employing critique of essentialism allows African Americans to acknowledge the way in which class mobility has altered collective black experience, so that racism does not necessarily have the same impact on our lives. In other words, it's a very different experience being a middle-class, well-educated, well-moneyed black person in America than someone who's unemployed and lives on a project. Okay? Such critiques allow us to affirm multiple black identities, varied black experience. It also challenges colonial, imperialist paradigms of black identity, which represent blackness one-dimensionally in ways that reinforce and sustain white supremacy. This discourse created the idea of the primitive and promoted the notion of an authentic experience, seeing as natural those expressions of black life which conform to a pre-existing pattern or stereotype. Abandoning essentialist notions would be a serious challenge to racism. Contemporary African American resistance struggle must be rooted in a process of decolonization that continually opposes reinscribing notions of authentic black identity. And as you'll see, this notion of authentic black identity is one of the themes that the film will take up and question.
As with other forms of oppression, however, it is crucial not to lose contact with the materiality of black women's lives. Another quote from Mirza. To valorize our different experience means we have to locate that experience in materiality. Holding on to the struggle against inequality and for social justice anchors the Black Feminist Project. For it seems whatever the subject of postmodern theorizing, black women remain subject to discrimination and exclusion. This is one of the, this refers to one of the problems that we find with a lot of postmodern writing. It's also part of the critique of the shift. It's like the critique of the shift from feminist studies to gender studies, or some of the problems that have been identified with queer, which we'll come back to tomorrow. If you're not careful, the material discrimination and exclusion of everyday lives seems to sort of recede into the background, basically. Black women remain preoccupied with their struggle against low pay, ill health and incarceration, and for access to care, welfare and education. In spite of postmodernism, it must change for the majority of black women globally and nationally. For them, power is not diffuse, localized and particular. Power is centralized and secure as it always has been, including defining and self-legitimating. Okay, women of colour and feminism. A theory in the flesh means one where the physical realities of our lives, our skin colour, the land or concrete we grew up on, our sexual longings, all fuse to create a politics born out of necessity. Here we attempt to bridge the contradictions in our experience. We are the coloured in the white feminist movement. We are the feminists among the people of our culture. We are often lesbians among the straight. We do this bridging by naming ourselves and by telling our stories in our own words. These are Chicana American feminist writers. Okay. In the introduction to this very important book that came out in '91, this bridge called My Back, Sherry Morega and Gloria Anzaldúa described how, quote, what began as a reaction to the racism of white feminists, soon became a positive affirmation of the commitment of women of colour to our own feminism. This concept of one's own feminism recognises the specificity of different groups of women and the particular forms of power and oppression with which they are confronted. So we're moving away here from sort of general theories of patriarchal oppression to look at the specificities of particular groups. Central here are understandings of place, history, language and culture. That is, questions of ethnic belonging, as well as the broader power structures of class, gender and race. And this sort of move, I mean, this is very early, 1981, that's why I think it's very difficult to have this sort of fixed notion of waves, really. If you think about something like contemporary Islamic feminism, that would fit within this sort of model, where you look at place, history, language, culture and religion, of course. You know, if you're a Saudi woman, American radical feminism, not a great deal of help to you. But developing your own indigenous located Islamic feminism, which allows you to begin to shift the position of women in Saudi society, is much more useful. Gloria Anzaldúa undertakes a journey into the history of her people and how this history has shaped the material conditions under which Chicanos and Chicanas live today. And that's her book, Borderlands, the New Mestiza. We'll talk about the New Mestiza in a moment. Borderlands, La Frontera. So it's written in two languages. It's written in English and Spanish. Okay. For women of colour, questions of race and racism are often conflated with questions of ethnicity. It's really important to draw that distinction between race Ethnicity is not the same thing as race, nor should it be collapsed into it. Ethnicity is a question of history, language, place and culture, which affects white people as well as people of colour. And white people have ethnicities. Korean people have ethnicity. If everybody has an ethnicity, it's got to do with, the culture within which you grow up. Yet where people of colour are concerned, there is a widespread tendency to make assumptions about ethnic identity on the basis of what people look like. If you went back 20 years in Britain, you would still find this quite strong. Britain's moved an awful long way, and certainly people coming from Korea are always very surprised at what it looks like these days, especially London, because there are, it is so mixed, and mixed relationships are very, very normal. It's quite, I've had Korean students come over to spend a semester in Cardiff who've been quite shocked really about what Britain looks like. But if you went back 20 years, maybe 30 years, people would have made assumptions. Yeah, if they heard the sort of things that advertising used to play around with on British television, where you would have somebody advertising, maybe some form of Chinese food, and they would look Chinese, but they would have a really strong Glaswegian accent. Yeah. So if you closed your eyes, you were thinking, you would assume you were speaking to a white Glaswegian person, so, because the assumption was that if you speak like that way, you look that way. Yeah. Whereas now in Britain and in other parts of Europe as well, you cannot make those sorts of assumptions. The way people talk, the way people look, doesn't tell you who they are, what their ethnicity is, or what their culture is. Okay? And we've got an example of it here. I'm coming up to an example of it. Yet where people of colour are concerned, there is a widespread tendency to make assumptions about ethnic identity on the basis of what people look like. White ethnocentrism and racism both structure the world which people of colour inhabit, causing crises of identity. As Nellie Wong put it in her poem, When I Was Growing Up, this is her poem, 1981, when I was growing up, I hungered for American food, American styles, coded white, even to me, a child. So she coded herself as, that these things that she wanted, these American foods, these American styles were coded as white, not as American. Okay? Born of Chinese parents, being Chinese was feeling foreign, was limiting, was un-American. The feeling of un-Americanness expressed in this poem arises out of the dominant racist identification of Americanness with whiteness and non-whiteness with an otherness, which makes it, by definition, inferior. The tendency to make assumptions about cultural identity on the basis of how a person looks is a particular problem in societies with one dominant group and minorities. The collapsing of skin colour, phenotype and culture is both limiting and exclusive in its effects. The fact that a person looks black or Asian does not mean that her identity and culture will necessarily be either. Moving beyond binaries then, it's the final section of this talk. Racist binaries of difference remain trapped within sets of binary oppositions, racist definitions of difference, remain trapped within sets of binary oppositions in which one term is privileged over the other. White over black, first over third world. The oppositions also presuppose that a person is either one thing or the other. You can't be a mixture, you can't be both. Okay? In recent writings, influenced by postmodern thinking, attempts have been made to deconstruct race and develop new ideas of hybridity as alternatives to the binary oppositions which structure racist ideas of difference. For example, Gloria Anzaldúa draws on her own experience, history and place, to suggest that the new mestiza, the new mixed person, women who are racially and ethnically mixed, are in a position to challenge and move beyond the binaries which structure racism, sexism, heterosexism, and ethnocentrism. This new mestiza calls into question borders and boundaries, and the functioning of Western analytic reasoning, which uses rationality to move towards a single goal. She develops a tolerance for contradiction, a tolerance for ambiguity. The work of mestiza consciousness is to break down the subject-object duality that keeps her a prisoner, and to show in the flesh and through images in her work how duality is transcended. The answer to the problem between the white race and the coloured, between males and females, lies in healing the splits that originate in the very foundations of our lives, our culture, our language, our thoughts. A massive uprooting of dualistic thinking in the individual and collective consciousness is the beginning of a long struggle, but one that could, in our best hopes, bring us an end of rape, of violence, of war. This mestiza consciousness, which in some ways resembles Homi Bhabha's concept of a third space, which is very important in post-colonial theory, opens up a utopian vision of a world in which difference is valued and respected, not produced by hierarchical power relations which oppress. Okay, so the idea that difference makes the society richer, and it's valuable, and it has someone to contribute. Other writers, particularly women of mixed heritage, have also argued for the need to challenge the binary positions which govern racialized thinking and force them to define themselves as only one thing. Yeah. Okay, so we'll have a break now, and we need something to play this.